They never expected mercy, not after everything the world had turned into. And if you had seen them that morning, thin coats wrapped around shaking shoulders, boots worn down to paper, you would have thought the same thing they did. Whatever waits at the end of this road can't possibly be kindness. But here's the strange part. Here's the piece of history almost no one talks about. Sometimes, in the middle of the ugliest war humanity ever made, kindness still found its way through the cracks. And for a group of German women, nurses, auxiliaries, radio operators, it arrived in a way they could have never imagined. Not through peace talks, not through promises, but through hot soup. It sounds almost ridiculous, right? Soup. A simple bowl, something so ordinary in peacetime that we barely think about it. But when you've marched across frozen roads for days, when you haven't tasted warmth on your tongue in weeks, when fear has wiped out your ability to hope, that first breath of steam rising from a bowl can feel like a miracle trying to speak. And maybe that's why this story still lingers in the quiet corners of memory. Because it's not about battles or victories. It's about the moment enemies looked at each other and saw something painfully familiar: hunger, exhaustion, and the desperate wish for the world to stop hurting. Back then, German propaganda had hammered one message into these women's minds: never surrender to the Americans. They are monsters. Cruel, inhuman. So when the convoy halted on a muddy road, and the women realized they were now prisoners of the U.S. Army, their hearts didn't just race, they collapsed into dread. But every story has a moment where the truth starts to whisper through the cracks, where fear begins to loosen its grip. And for these women, that moment was still hours away. Right now, all they knew was the cold, the uncertainty, and the long road stretching west. As the trucks rolled on, one of the women, Lissel, a young nurse who'd spent 2 years patching soldiers younger than herself, pressed her fingers against the side of the canvas truck, trying to steady the tremble in her hands. She wasn't alone. Around her, faces looked hollowed out by war, eyes searching, guessing, quietly praying that whatever awaited them wouldn't be worse than what they'd already survived. Someone whispered, "Do you think they'll separate us?" Someone else muttered, "Americans don't take prisoners. They shoot them." Another voice, older, tired, "We'll find out soon enough." The road curved through ruined villages, places where windows hung open like stunned mouths and chimneys pointed accusingly at the sky. Every mile felt like being carried deeper into a story they had no control over. But even in that fear, something strange was happening. The guards weren't shouting. They weren't hitting anyone. They weren't even looking at the women with the contempt they expected. They just escorted them. Quietly. Efficiently, almost respectfully. It didn't make sense, and that confusion only made the fear sharper. By the time the convoy finally slowed, the sun was lowering behind a pale winter sky. A line of tents and wooden buildings came into view, an American run holding camp in northern France. Nothing grand, nothing soft, but not the nightmare they'd imagined either. Lissel felt her breath catch. This wasn't what she'd been told to fear. And yet, she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Not yet. Not after everything the war had taught her. The truck stopped. The gates opened. The women stepped down one by one, their boots sinking into the cold dirt. A quiet breeze carried the faintest hint of smoke, firewood burning somewhere deeper in the camp. They didn't know it yet, but that scent would soon change everything. And the first real surprise, one that would unsettle them almost as much as it comforted them, was only moments away. Because the Americans weren't preparing interrogations. They were preparing dinner. They had barely taken 10 steps past the gate when the first wave of confusion hit them. Not fear, not panic, just confusion, the kind that creeps in when the world stops behaving the way you were taught it should. The American soldiers weren't shouting. They weren't raising rifles or ordering anyone to kneel. They simply guided the women toward a long wooden table where a few men in clean uniforms waited with papers, pencils, and an unexpectedly calm tone in their voices. It felt unreal. For weeks, these women had lived inside the echo of German propaganda, voices warning them that surrendering to Americans meant humiliation or worse. But here, The only sound was the steady scratching of pencils and the low rumble of English they could barely understand. Lissel stood in the line, clutching her thin coat, trying not to stare. One of the Americans, a young man with sandy hair and a gentle posture, offered a simple gesture. He pointed to her name tag, then to the form as if to say, "It's all right, just right." She hesitated. Was it a trick? Was it some preparation for interrogation? But the man waited patiently, and for a moment Lissel felt something she didn't expect at all. She felt seen, not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as a person. Around her, the women whispered in low German tones. "Why are they so calm? I thought they hated us. Maybe this is temporary." And maybe it was. Camps were still camps. Barbed wire, guard towers, boundaries that reminded you freedom was something you used to have. But even so, the atmosphere felt different from the cold, rigid discipline they had braced themselves for. Inside one of the tents, an American medic checked the women for frostbite and infections. The touch was clinical but gentle. A few women flinched, half from fear, half from the shock of someone tending to them instead of ordering them around. Then came blankets, actual wool blankets, clean ones, handed out one by one as the sun dipped lower and the camp filled with the deepening blue of evening. Lissel wrapped hers around her shoulders, feeling the warmth seep in like a forgotten memory. She didn't trust it, how could she? Nothing in war came without reason. Nothing gentle arrived without a cost, but still, it felt good. Too good. Across the yard, an American officer stood with his hands behind his back, observing the new arrivals. He wasn't tall, wasn't imposing, but his expression carried a kind of steady composure that made the women straighten slightly, unsure whether to fear him or respect him. And then something unexpected happened, something so small it almost passed unnoticed. One of the women, Marta, slipped on the uneven ground and nearly fell. In an instant, the officer stepped forward and caught her by the arm, steadying her before she hit the dirt. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was just human. Marta whispered a shaky dank. The officer gave a faint nod, then stepped back into place without a word. Moments later, a gust of cold wind swept through the camp. The women shivered, huddling closer together, clutching their blankets. And as the night settled in, something drifted toward them on that wind, something faint, warm, and impossible to ignore. A smell, not smoke, not fuel, not the sharp bite of winter air, but something softer, something that felt like home. Lissel caught it first. Her eyes widened and she turned toward the row of buildings near the far end of the camp. It couldn't be. But the scent grew stronger, rich, warm, comforting. Soup. Hot, simmering soup. The realization rippled through the line like a spark through dry grass. Women lifted their heads, sniffing the air, whispering to each other with disbelief braided into every breath. No, it can't be. They wouldn't, would they? Are they cooking for us? Everything they thought they knew about their captors, every warning, every fear, suddenly felt uncertain. Because nothing about this camp looked like the cruelty they had been prepared for. And the Americans weren't preparing punishment. They were preparing dinner. The night deepened, and with every passing minute the smell grew richer, fuller, more undeniable. Something was coming. Something that would shake them deeper than any bullet or bomb ever had. Soon, they would be invited to eat, and that single gesture would change everything. By the time the last light slipped behind the camp fences, the scent had grown so strong that the women couldn't ignore it anymore. It drifted through the air like a memory, soft, warm, familiar in a way that made their throats tighten. After weeks of dirt, cold, and fear, the smell of food felt almost unreal, like something their minds had invented to comfort them. Lissel stood near the edge of the group, trying to breathe as quietly as she could. Every inhale brought her back to her mother's small kitchen in Bremen, a tiny pot steaming on the stove, the kind of evening she never thought she'd miss. But the mind does strange things when the world falls apart. And tonight, that smell made the past feel too close, too tender. A woman beside her murmured, "Do they really expect us to believe this?" Another answered, "Americans feed their own first. We'll get scraps, if anything." Someone else whispered, "Maybe it's not for us at all." Hope and doubt tugged at them from opposite sides. A group of American cooks walked by carrying metal containers, steam lifting into the cold night air. The women watched every step, eyes wide, hungry for answers as much as for food. No one explained anything. No guard shouted instructions. No officer barked orders. That silence was almost worse, because uncertainty has a way of magnifying fear. Just when the women began expecting the worst again, a small lantern flickered on near the outdoor kitchen area. A soldier lifted a ladle from a pot, tasted it, nodded, and then set the ladle down with a satisfied smile. He smiled. A simple, unguarded smile. Lissel felt her stomach knot. Why would someone smile over preparing food for prisoners? It didn't fit anything she'd been told, anything she believed about what surrender meant. She remembered a line from her training: "The enemy wants your mind before your body, trust nothing." But here, watching that cook, she didn't see manipulation or threat. She saw a tired young man making sure a meal didn't burn. The contradictions were exhausting. Finally, a guard approached the group. He spoke slowly, carefully, using simple English mixed with gestures. He pointed to the dining tent, then to his wrist, pretending to tap the time. They were going to be fed, properly, in the tent, like human beings. The realization rippled through them in ways they didn't know how to process. A few women exchanged stunned looks. Some shook their heads, refusing to believe it. One woman, Gertrude, covered her mouth as if afraid she might cry. Because hunger wasn't their only ache. It was everything else: the humiliation of defeat, the loss of home, the crushing uncertainty of the future. Food wouldn't erase any of that. But it reminded them of something the war had stolen, the feeling that they were worth caring for. As they waited to be escorted, the scent of the soup grew richer: potatoes, carrots, maybe a bit of barley. A simple meal, but warm. And in war, warmth was a luxury that felt almost personal. A few American medics stood near the tent, adjusting lanterns, making space. One of them, a man with gentle eyes and sleeves rolled up to his elbows, noticed the women shivering in the cold. He walked over and motioned for them to step closer to the tent where a stove glowed faintly inside. No words, just a gesture, an invitation to warmth. Some stepped forward cautiously. Others held back, unsure whether accepting kindness was allowed. Lissel stayed in the middle. Her heart pulled one way, her training the other. But every passing second made one thing clearer: whatever the Americans were doing, it wasn't cruelty. Still, a question lingered in her mind, heavy and uneasy. Why? Why treat us gently? Why feed us? What do they want? War had taught her that nothing came without a price. But tonight, as the guards began forming a line and opening the flap of the dining tent, she couldn't help feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Not trust, not comfort, just a faint, trembling curiosity. And in a few minutes, when she would finally step inside that tent and wrap her hands around the first warm bowl she'd held in weeks, curiosity would turn into something far more powerful, something she wasn't ready for, something that would stay with her long after the war ended. The moment they stepped inside the tent, a hush fell over the group. It wasn't enforced silence, just the kind that happens when people walk into something they never expected to see. Lanterns hung from ropes overhead, casting a warm, golden glow. The air inside was thick with steam rising from several large metal pots, each one gently bubbling as if whispering, "You're safe for a moment, just breathe." But breathing wasn't easy. Not when the mind had been preparing for punishment, not comfort. Not when fear had been your only companion for weeks. And especially not when every instinct warned you, this must be a trick. The women formed an uneven line, hesitant, stiff, glancing around as if waiting for someone to snap the illusion in half. But nothing broke. Nothing cracked. The Americans simply kept working, ladling soup, arranging bread. Setting out tin cups like this was any other evening in any other place untouched by war. Lissel stood frozen for a moment. Her eyes kept drifting to the steam rising from the bowls. She hadn't seen steam in God, how long had it been? Even in field hospitals, things were rushed, cold, rationed. She couldn't remember the last time something felt deliberately warm. A young American cook caught her eye. He didn't smile, didn't gesture, just gave a small nod that said, "Go ahead, it's okay." That single nod carried more gentleness than she had been shown in months. When her turn came, Lissel held the bowl carefully, almost fearfully. Her hands trembled not just from cold but from disbelief. She stared at the surface of the soup, watching tiny circles form as the steam curled up toward her face. Potatoes, carrots, a hint of onion, nothing extravagant, nothing celebratory, just real food, real warmth. Behind her, Marta whispered, "Is this really for us?" And Gertrude, her voice barely audible, replied, "I don't understand." Why be kind to the enemy? No one had an answer. Even the Americans working inside the tent seemed unaware of how deeply this moment was affecting the women. To them, it was routine. Feed the prisoners, keep order, maintain humanity in a world that had lost its way. But to the prisoners, this meal was a contradiction wrapped in steam. Lissel raised the bowl slightly, warming her fingertips. She brought it closer to her chin, letting the heat touch her face before taking the first sip. The moment the soup touched her tongue, something inside her gave way, not dramatically, not visibly, just a quiet, hidden break like a knot loosening after being tightened for too long. It wasn't extraordinary soup. It wasn't seasoned like home, but it was warm. And in that warmth lived a reminder she didn't expect to feel: you are still alive. She swallowed hard, not because of the taste, but because of the emotion behind it. She didn't want anyone to see how much it meant, but she knew. They all knew. Across the tent, a few women lowered their faces into their bowls, pretending to breathe in the steam so no one would notice the tears gathering in their eyes. War takes away dignity in small, subtle ways. Tonight, dignity was being handed back in the form of a simple meal. A quiet murmur spread across the tables, nothing loud, just fragile gratitude wrapped in disbelief. The women looked at each other with a kind of softness that hadn't existed on the road earlier. Fear hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip. The American medic, the same gentle-eyed man from earlier, moved down the row, checking if anyone needed help. When he paused near Lissel, she looked up, startled. He pointed at her bowl, then made a small thumbs-up gesture, unsure how to ask her if the food was okay. She didn't know what to say. Words failed her in both languages. So she did something she hadn't done in months. She nodded back. Just one small nod. But in that exchange, an invisible barrier cracked. Not broken, not erased, just cracked enough to let light through. As the meal continued, the tent filled with a strange mixture of silence and warmth. Silent because the women were too hungry and overwhelmed to speak. Warm because the soup was doing its quiet work, melting fear, softening edges, stitching something human back together. By the time they finished, night had wrapped itself fully around the camp. The guards signaled gently for the women to follow them to their sleeping quarters. No hurting, no yelling, just guidance. Lissel stepped outside, cradling the faint memory of warmth in her hands even though the bowl was empty now. The cold air hit her face, but it didn't sting like before. Something inside her had changed, even if she couldn't name it yet. Behind her, the kitchen tent still glowed softly, as if reminding her, the world is broken, yes, but not everyone in it is. And as she walked toward the barracks, she felt a new, quiet question rising inside her. If this is how the Americans treat prisoners, what else about the war was a lie? The night offered no answer, but tomorrow would. The night settled softly over the camp, wrapping everything in a thick quiet that felt heavier than the blankets the women carried. Sleep didn't come easily, not because the barracks were uncomfortable, but because their minds were too full, too tangled. Warm soup had stirred something inside them, something almost dangerous in wartime. The awareness that the enemy might not be the monster they'd imagined. By morning, whispers drifted across the women's quarters like cautious birds. Did you see how they served us? That medic, he helped Anna with her ankle. They weren't mocking us. No one said the word kindness out loud. It felt too fragile, too unbelievable to name. When the women stepped outside, the sun was pale, the ground still firm with frost. American guards were already stationed nearby, but not with the stiff aggression the women expected. One guard leaned against a post, sipping something warm from a tin cup. Another nodded politely as the women passed, as if acknowledging neighbors rather than prisoners. This simple, ordinary humanity felt more disorienting than any shouted command could have. Around mid-morning, the women were guided toward a common area, a stretch of cleared ground where prisoners could walk under supervision. Lissel stayed close to Marta and Gertrude, unsure what the day might bring, unsure how to feel about being in a place where the rules seemed strangely gentle. A group of American soldiers rolled a crate to the side of a building, sitting casually, talking in low voices. A radio crackled softly beside them, playing music, a tune with slow strings and a warm, nostalgic tone that drifted through the air like a whisper from another world. Music. Lissel felt her heart twist. She hadn't heard anything like it in months. The melody floated through the cold morning, landing in places inside her she'd forgotten existed. Some of the women paused, heads turning slightly, their expressions softening despite themselves. Marta let out a shaky breath. "I used to dance to something like this," she whispered. "Before everything changed." Gertrude closed her eyes. "I didn't realize how much I missed hearing anything beautiful." The Americans noticed the women listening but didn't turn off the radio. Instead, one of the soldiers adjusted the volume, just slightly, as if saying, "If you need this too, take it." A few minutes later, something even more unexpected happened. One of the soldiers' dark hair, friendly face stepped toward the group, hands open to show he meant no harm. He spoke slowly with careful English, as if trying to make the words simple enough for them to understand. "You, okay, need anything?" He pointed to their boots, then their coats. "Cold." The women exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to being asked questions. They were used to being told. Gertrude, ever the cautious one, shook her head politely, not trusting her own voice. But another woman, Anna, lifted her foot slightly to show the torn sole of her boot. The soldier nodded and gestured for her to follow him to a small supply tent. She hesitated. Lissel felt her breath catch. This could be dangerous. This could be a mistake. But Anna limped behind the soldier, and within minutes she returned wearing a pair of worn but intact American-issued boots. She held her old ones in her hands like the husk of a life she was slowly shedding. "I don't understand them," she murmured, bewildered. "They're supposed to despise us." Lissel stayed quiet, but inside something shifted, like the feeling you get when a locked door clicks from the inside. Later, as the women rested near the fence, the American medic walked by again, the same man whose eyes carried more sincerity than authority. He paused near Lissel and tapped the scarf around her neck, raising his eyebrows in a silent question. She blinked, unsure. He repeated the gesture. Then he motioned toward the small aid tent, miming the act of wrapping something around his own neck. Only then did she understand. He was offering her a warmer scarf. She hesitated for a long moment, her pride and fear clashing like two armies inside her chest. Accepting kindness from an enemy felt like breaking some invisible oath, but refusing it felt ungrateful, almost childish, considering how the past day had unfolded. Finally, she nodded. Inside the aid tent, he handed her a simple wool scarf, gray, soft, still carrying a faint scent of campfire smoke. She wrapped it around her neck, feeling warmth bloom along her collarbones. He gave a tiny smile, not flirtatious, not pitying, just human. "Warm," he said, tapping the scarf lightly. Lissel swallowed hard. "Warm," she echoed, her accent thick. It was their first shared word. Across the yard, something else was happening, small exchanges, tiny sparks of connection forming between women who had surrendered everything and men who were supposed to see them as enemies. Someone asked for water. Someone received an extra piece of bread. Someone overheard an American tell another, "They're just people, man, just people." That line floated through the cold air and landed softly on Lissel's shoulders. Just people. For months, the war had taught her that enemies were faceless shadows, dangerous, heartless, unimaginable. But here she saw them listening to music, sharing jokes, adjusting their boots, handing out scarves. Here enemies had faces, voices, families in photographs tucked into pockets. Here kindness wasn't impossible. It just wasn't expected. As the day stretched on, the women walked back to their barracks carrying more questions than fear. Soup had opened the first door. These quiet, unexpected conversations were opening the next. And Lissel had a feeling that tomorrow, something even more personal would happen. Something that would blur the line between prisoner and captor in a way she wasn't ready to admit mattered. Morning arrived gently, the kind of soft gray light that seemed to wash the world clean without actually fixing anything. Frost clung to the edges of the barracks windows, and the women woke slowly, stretching stiff limbs beneath blankets that still felt like borrowed comfort. For the first time since their capture, no one woke in panic. No shouting. No boots pounding against doors. Just the quiet murmur of women remembering what normal mornings once felt like. When Lissel stepped outside, she noticed the Americans setting up a small table near the administrative tent, stacks of paper, pencils, and a metal box that glinted faintly in the cold. At first, she didn't understand what it was for. None of them did. But then one of the guards approached, speaking slow, deliberate English. "You write, letter, home." He pointed to the table, then to his chest, then made a spreading gesture with his hands as if saying, "We will send them." The women stared. A few gasped. Someone actually clutched her chest as if struck. Letters for them, sent home, it felt impossible. Communication was the most tightly controlled privilege in wartime. The idea that prisoners' enemy women could write freely to their families felt like a mercy too large to trust. Marta whispered, "What if it's a trick?" Gertrude said. "Or what if they read them first?" Someone else murmured, "Even if they do, my mother would know I'm alive." That single sentence carried more weight than any argument. One by one, cautiously, they approached the table. The Americans didn't rush them, didn't bark instructions. They simply handed out sheets of paper and short wooden pencils, the kind that looked like they were meant for schoolchildren rather than prisoners of war. Lissel took a sheet in trembling hands. The paper felt too clean, too smooth, like something sacred. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The last letter she'd written was months ago, hurriedly scribbled in a cold bunk under dim candlelight, telling her parents not to worry even though everything was already falling apart. She never knew if that letter reached them. She never knew if they were still alive. Now the blank page stared up at her, waiting. Her throat tightened. How do you begin a letter to a family who thinks you might be dead? Around her, women wrote slowly, hesitantly. Some paused every few lines, wiping tears with frayed sleeves. Others sat motionless for minutes before mustering the courage to write the first word. Lissel finally pressed the pencil to the page. "Lieb Mama, lieber Papa," she froze. The words looked too small for the weight they carried. She tried again. "I am alive." Her breath trembled as she wrote the sentence, each letter feeling like it was coming from somewhere deeper than memory. She continued slowly, describing the journey west, the fear, the hunger. Chose her words carefully, soft enough not to worry them too much, honest enough not to lie entirely. But then came the part she didn't know how to phrase. "How do I tell them the Americans served us hot soup?" she whispered under her breath. It felt absurd, beautiful, shameful, comforting. She decided to write it plainly. "The Americans have treated us with unexpected kindness. They gave us warm clothes and hot soup. I didn't believe such things could happen in war." The pencil stopped moving. Her eye caught the faint tremble of her own handwriting. Admitting kindness from the enemy felt like tearing open a wound she had kept closed for years. But it also felt like truth, something she needed to give back to the people waiting for her. Across the table, Marta wrote with stiff fingers. Gertrude pressed her forehead into her palm, overwhelmed. Anna, wearing the American boots she'd been given yesterday, finished her letter quickly, then folded it neatly with a kind of reverence. When Lissel finally stood and handed her letter to the American guard, she didn't expect anything more than a nod. But the guard took the paper gently, almost respectfully, and placed it carefully into the box with the others. He looked at her and tapped his chest lightly over his heart before pointing to the box. A simple gesture, but Lissel understood. "We will take care of these." Her eyes burned, but she didn't look away. As the women walked back toward the barracks, something had changed, not in the camp, but in them. Letters had opened a door they didn't even realize was still locked inside their chests. The war wasn't over. They were still prisoners. But the moment ink touched paper, they remembered they were daughters, sisters, wives, human beings with people waiting somewhere beyond the chaos. And in that fragile remembering, hope had taken its first cautious breath. Later that day, as Lissel warmed her hands near a stove, she saw the American medic again. He wasn't carrying bandages this time. He wasn't treating anyone. He was holding a small stack of envelopes, family photos inside them. He slipped one into his coat pocket, smiling softly at the memory it carried. The sight made her pause. Enemies weren't supposed to have families. They weren't supposed to have smiles like that. But he did. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, the distance between them felt smaller than ever before. Something was changing. In her, around her, in the camp itself. And tomorrow, that change would become impossible to ignore. Winter settled over the camp in slow, deliberate layers. Cold mornings, pale afternoons, and nights that wrapped themselves tightly around every wooden beam and canvas flap. Yet inside the fences, something else was thawing. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It didn't come with announcements or speeches. It simply grew quietly, like warmth returning to frozen fingers. Routine had found its way into their lives. Wake up, check in, help with chores if assigned, walk under supervision. Eat meals that no longer felt like a miracle but still carried a quiet gratitude. But beneath those simple rhythms, deeper changes stirred, shifts none of the women would have believed possible even a week earlier. Lissel noticed it first in the way people stood. On the first days, everyone kept their shoulders tight, their chins tucked, their posture like brittle wood bracing for impact. Now their movements felt looser, more grounded, as if their bodies were remembering how to exist without constant fear. She felt it in herself, too. The scarf the American medic had given her had worked its way into her routines, not just as something warm, but as something strangely reassuring. Every time she wrapped it around her neck, she felt a small reminder of the moment someone had cared enough to notice she was cold. And then there were the tasks. Not forced labor, not punishment. Just simple work meant to keep the camp functioning and give the prisoners purpose, something war had ripped from them long ago. Some women helped peel potatoes or wash metal trays. Others assisted the medics with sorting basic supplies, linen, bandages, soap. Marta, who had always been stubbornly meticulous, volunteered to help in the laundry tent, grateful for the distraction and the warmth of the steaming tubs. Lissel found herself in the medical tent more often than she expected, not as a patient, but because the American medic had asked the guards if she could help organize the shelves. Her background as a nurse made her useful, and the Americans seemed to value usefulness over ideology. The medic's name, she learned by accident, was Daniel Reed. She heard another soldier call out, "Reed, you need more gauze," and watched him raise a hand in reply. That was all. No dramatic introduction. No exchange of stories. Just a name slipping quietly into her world. She repeated it once in her mind, Daniel Reed. The sound felt strange, like trying on a coat that didn't belong to you but somehow fit anyway. Working beside him was unsettling in ways that surprised her. He was gentle but not soft, focused but never harsh. He spoke sparingly, using gestures more than words, aware of the language barrier but unwilling to let it stop him from communicating. Once, as they sorted bandages, he pointed to a roll and said slowly, "Clean, good." Then he pointed to another, stained from transport. "Dirty, bad." She laughed quietly, unexpectedly. He looked startled for a moment, then laughed too, shaking his head at his own broken German-infused English. That small shared moment settled between them like a warm stone, grounding, steady. For the first time, she wasn't seeing an enemy or a captor. She was seeing a man, just a man trying to do his job in a world turned upside down. Outside the tent, the camp buzzed with quiet hints of change too. American soldiers sometimes played cards near the mess hall during breaks, their laughter rising and falling like a language Lissel didn't fully understand but recognized as normalcy. Some prisoners sat nearby, pretending not to listen, pretending not to find comfort in the sound. Someone hung laundry on a line to dry shirts, socks, linen sheets flapping lightly in the cold wind like white flags of truce. At dusk, music floated again from the radio, soft jazz, the kind of melody that didn't demand attention but offered company. A few prisoners paused to listen, their faces softening in the lantern light. Even Gertrude, who had distrusted everything from day one, admitted quietly, "It's strange, but the camp doesn't feel hostile anymore." Lissel nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. But the growing ease brought something else too: guilt. Kindness from the enemy created a tension inside the women, especially those who had seen the harshness on the Eastern Front or the devastation of Allied bombings. They didn't know how to reconcile the world they had survived with the reality they were living now. At night, Lissel would lie awake, thinking about the patients she'd tended to. The wounded boys brought back from battlefields, trembling, bleeding, begging her to write letters home for them. She wondered how many American medics had done the same for their own men. She wondered if Daniel had lost friends too. She wondered why kindness felt like betrayal. One afternoon, as she finished stacking boxes in the tent, Daniel handed her a cup of warm water, barely more than a gesture but enough to chase away some of the cold. She accepted it carefully. He pointed at her hands, red from the cold, and said, "Too cold." Then he motioned toward the stove. "Warm, sit." She shook her head at first, instinctively refusing comfort. But he simply nodded again and stepped aside, making space. So she sat, and for a moment the war felt far away, too far, dangerously far. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light flakes drifting down like pieces of silence. The camp looked softer in the white coat, almost gentle. Winter was settling deeper, but so was something else. Trust wasn't the right word, neither was friendship. It was something quieter, smaller, more fragile, like the first thin line of thaw appearing on a frozen river. And soon that thaw would spread. Because across the camp, news was starting to ripple through the guards, whispered from one soldier to another. News that would change the atmosphere in ways no one was prepared for. News that the war might be nearing its end. But for now, Lissel didn't know that. All she knew was the heat from the stove, the scarf around her neck, and the strange, undeniable truth. Kindness was beginning to matter, more than she ever expected. Snow had settled on the camp like a quiet blanket by the time whispers began to spread, soft at first, drifting from tent to tent, guard to guard, until even the prisoners could feel the tension shifting in the air. Something was different. Something was coming. It lingered in the way the Americans moved, quicker, lighter, as if words were bubbling inside them they weren't yet allowed to say. Lissel noticed it while sorting bandages that morning. Daniel Reed, usually calm and steady as a river stone, seemed distracted. His hands moved automatically, but his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance of the tent. Twice he paused mid-task. Once he almost smiled at nothing. It wasn't the smile of a man remembering home. It was the smile of a man holding a secret. When she handed him a roll of gauze, he startled slightly, as if she had pulled him out of some distant thought. "You here?" he asked quietly, tapping his ear. She blinked, confused. "Hear what?" He hesitated, not from reluctance, but from the weight of the news he carried. Then he gently placed a hand over his chest and whispered a single word. "Germany." Her breath caught. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. She stared at him, but he didn't elaborate. He simply nodded toward the camp gates, where distant murmurs continued like the low hum of a storm on the horizon. That afternoon, the women gathered in the courtyard under armed supervision, but the guards looked less severe than usual. One leaned toward another, whispering. Another tapped his radio, adjusting the static. Someone laughed quietly, nervously, almost reluctantly, as if unsure whether joy was appropriate. Marta moved closer to Lissel. "Something's happened," she muttered. "I can feel it." "Good or bad?" Lissel asked. "I don't know," Marta whispered, pulling her coat tighter. "But it's big." Minutes later, an American officer stepped forward with a folded paper in his hand. The prisoners fell silent, the air tightening with expectation. The officer cleared his throat and spoke loudly, slowly, trying to shape English words that the women might understand. "Germany," a pause, softer now but heavy with meaning, "has surrendered." The earth didn't shake. The sky didn't split open. No music rose from the ground. But inside every woman something collapsed and rebuilt itself in the same breath. Some gasped, some cried. Some stared blankly, the words too large to fit inside their minds. Gertrude covered her mouth. "It's over," Marta whispered. "Then what are we now?" And Lissel, she felt her knees weaken. For years, war had been a constant hum behind her ribs, a steady pulse reminding her that danger was always near, that death could arrive at any moment. Now that hum went suddenly quiet, leaving an empty space she didn't know how to fill. Officer continued speaking, but the women had stopped listening. Their ears were ringing with the simple, unbelievable truth. The war was no longer theirs to survive. It was something that had happened, something finished. Lissel sank onto a wooden bench, staring at her trembling hands. She wasn't sure whether to feel relief or shame, pride or grief, joy or fear. The collapse of the world she grew up in felt nothing like the victory speeches she'd heard in propaganda broadcasts. It felt hollow, confusing, painful in ways she couldn't yet name. A moment later, Daniel approached carefully, holding 2 tin cups of warm water. He handed one to her. She didn't speak. He didn't force her to. He just sat beside her, shoulders barely touching, sharing the quiet. After a long silence, he said gently, "War finished." He tapped the ground with his boot, then spread his hands outward. "Now peace comes. Peace." Another word that felt too fragile to trust. As the hours passed, the camp changed, not physically but emotionally. Guards walked with lighter steps. Radios played louder. Soldiers exchanged relieved glances, the kind that said, "We might get to go home." But the women, their home lay in ruins, across oceans and borders and bombed-out cities. The war ending didn't mean safety. It meant stepping into a future they didn't recognize. That night inside the barracks, the mood was a strange mix of quiet hope and quiet mourning. Marta sat on her bunk, tracing circles on her blanket. Gertrude cried softly, not out of sadness or joy, but exhaustion. Lissel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the news settle into her bones. The war was over, but she wasn't ready for what came next. What would Germany look like when they returned? Would their families still be alive? Would there be food, work, shelter, or would they be seen as traitors for surrendering? Questions crowded her mind like shadows at the edge of a candle flame. But one thing she knew, one thing she couldn't deny anymore, was that American kindness had not been a trick or a strategy. It had been real. It had been human. And tomorrow, as the camp adjusted to this strange new reality, that kindness would become something even more unexpected. It would become connection. By the time spring began teasing the edges of winter away, the camp had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Snow melted into long streaks of mud, patches of stubborn grass pushed through the earth, and the air carried a gentler chill, one that reminded the women the world was slowly waking up again. But the biggest change wasn't in the weather. It was in them. The fear that once clung to their shoulders had loosened. The stiffness in their steps had softened. Even their silence was different now, not the wary quiet of prisoners, but the reflective quiet of people trying to understand what life meant after the world they knew had collapsed. One afternoon, as the women gathered in the courtyard, a familiar scent drifted across the camp. At first, no one noticed. Then someone lifted her head. Marta whispered, "Is that?" Gertrude nodded slowly, her eyes widening. "It is. Soup. The same warm, earthy smell that had stunned them on their first night here." the same smell that had shaken their certainty about the Americans, about their enemy, about themselves. Only this time it didn't feel impossible. It felt welcome. A guard motioned gently for the women to line up, but there was no confusion now, no hesitation. They moved with quiet understanding, almost with ease. When Lissel stepped inside the tent, she felt an odd warmth bloom in her chest. The scene looked the same as that first night, lanterns glowing, steam rising, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. Back then the soup had felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Why kindness? Why us? Tonight it felt like part of a story she had slowly grown into. As she approached the serving table, she saw Daniel Reed ladling soup into bowls, sleeves rolled up again, hair slightly mussed from the heat. When he saw her, he didn't nod formally like before. He smiled, small, warm, real. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't bold. It was simply human. She felt herself smile back just as softly, the gesture emerging before she could think twice. He handed her the bowl with a gentleness that no longer startled her. She accepted it without the old hesitation. Around her, the women took their bowls and sat at the long tables. And then something happened, something so subtle that Lissel almost missed it. They laughed. Not loudly, not carelessly, but they laughed. Tiny waves of sound like the first cracks of sunlight after a long storm. Someone joked about how watery the soup looked. Someone else teased Marta about taking the biggest piece of carrot. Even Gertrude, who once distrusted every kindness, shook her head with a half-smile she tried and failed to hide. The soup tasted the same as before, but everything around it tasted different now. It tasted like acceptance, like healing, like the first fragile threads of peace weaving themselves into their lives. Lissel took a slow sip, feeling the warmth move through her like a quiet reassurance. She didn't fight the comfort anymore. She didn't wonder if it was a trick. She didn't wonder if she deserved it. She just allowed herself to feel it. Across the table, Anna leaned close and whispered, "Strange, isn't it? How something as simple as soup can change everything." Lissel nodded. "Maybe it wasn't the soup," she said quietly. "Maybe it was the way they gave it." Later, as the women finished eating and began to leave, Daniel approached Lissel. He didn't say much. He usually didn't, but this time he tried something new. He pointed to her empty bowl and said softly, "Better this time." She understood the meaning beneath the words. Did it feel different now that fear is gone? She hesitated for only a moment before replying, "Yes, better." His smile deepened just slightly, the kind that lingered for a moment before settling into memory. Then he stepped aside to clean the tables, leaving her with a warmth she hadn't expected to carry into the evening. When Lissel walked out of the tent, she paused at the doorway, watching the sky streak itself in shades of fading blue and muted peach. For the first time since becoming a prisoner, she wasn't thinking about the past or the war or the endless uncertainty ahead. She was thinking about now, about warmth, about kindness, about the strange truth that sometimes enemies could show a gentleness that friends never had the chance to. The soup had changed nothing about their circumstances, and yet it had changed everything about their hearts. And as the women headed back toward their barracks, she sensed something in the air, an unspoken understanding that their time here was nearing its end. Release was coming, and with it, a final chapter none of them were ready to face. The morning of their release didn't look special at first. No grand announcement, no ceremony. Just a thin layer of mist curling above the camp and the soft shuffle of boots on frost-kissed ground. Yet every woman felt it, the strange heaviness in the air, the weight of an ending and the quiet beginning waiting beyond the fence. Lissel stood with her blanket folded in her arms, heart beating in a rhythm she couldn't name. Fear, hope, grief, maybe all of it tangled together. The gates that once felt like iron walls now seemed impossibly small for the emotions pressing inside her chest. One by one, their names were called, papers signed, belongings returned. The simple routines of departure somehow felt more intimate than their arrival had ever been. Marta hugged her tightly. "Whatever happens after this, I'm glad we weren't alone." Gertrude nodded, her eyes shining. "I didn't think I would survive this winter. I didn't think kindness was something I would see again." When Lissel stepped forward, Daniel Reed was waiting near the exit checkpoint. He wasn't wearing his medic bag today. No bandages, no gloves, just his uniform jacket and a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded scrap of fabric, her scarf. Washed, repaired, carefully refolded. He offered it to her with gentle hands as if returning a piece of memory. Lissel hesitated, then took it, fingers brushing against his. Warmth passed between them, not romantic, not hopeful, just honest human gratitude in its purest, quietest form. "Thank you," she whispered, the German laced with emotion. Daniel didn't understand all the words, but he understood the tone. He nodded once slowly, meaningfully, and placed his hand briefly over his heart. Not goodbye, not farewell, something softer. Something that said, "I'm glad I could help you find your way back to yourself." The gates opened. A thin path stretched beyond the fence, leading toward buses, then trains, then a Germany forever changed. The women stepped forward. Their boots pressed into the cold earth, leaving faint prints behind. Lissel paused for one last glance at the camp, the place that had begun as a cage but had slowly, almost impossibly, become the first safe space she'd known in years. Behind her, the kitchen fire burned low, sending a final curl of warm smoke into the morning air. And with it, the faint scent of soup, the same soup that had changed everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle deep inside her, something she could carry, something no borders or miles could take away. Then she lifted her head and stepped onto the road home. It wasn't the same road she had traveled weeks before. That one was filled with fear, hunger, and the darkness of war. But this road held possibility. A broken country waiting to be rebuilt. Families waiting to be found. Lives waiting to be lived again. And somewhere behind her, across fences and languages and uniforms, lived the memory of strangers who showed her kindness when she expected cruelty, who served her soup when all she expected was punishment. War had taken so much. But in that unexpected moment of warmth, she had learned something she would carry for the rest of her life. Even in the coldest winters of history, one bowl of hot soup can remind a human being that they are still human. She walked on. The road stretched forward, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself believe the world could become gentle again.